So what I want to do today is just recognize that's in the background as we seek to think, how do we as believers function as parents and relate to our children, not only when they're young, but as we see them growing up. So we're going to be talking, even this afternoon, most of the families that will be represented here have small children, and I recognize that. And I'm going to be talking about things that are relevant, but I never want to sort of view this thing as, well, you have small children, just think about how to raise small children, because your children are not going to stay small. And if you're going to have a vision for raising small children, you have to have a picture of what you want to see when they're adults and out of the house. And you need to work from that backwards. So that's big of what we're going to do today. So let me just give you an overview, sort of the Bible as a family manual. I'll mention this to the ladies today, but I'll tell you guys this. This material is more in kind of a manuscript form, and that's because it actually came from a book I wrote but have never published. There was a point in time when my son was 8 years old and my girls were in their early teens, and my son said, "Dad, you ought to write a book about parenting." And I was like, I told him, you're not done yet. What if you get messed up? So I don't want to write a book. And so he went and got a piece of paper, and he made me sign a contract. My dad will write a book about parenting when I forget how he wrote it. Actually, I have it. My dad will write a book when he no longer is parenting me. And so I said, that's so cute. And I just put it somewhere. I thought that'll be interesting to look at in the future. So the night before his wedding, he said, now you have to write that book. Right? And I was like, I don't want to write a parenting book. So then I just kind of dismissed it and said, that's a kid that's a young man. He was 20. He got married young, 20 years for us, 20. That's a young man feeling nostalgia. And then I was going through some papers and I found the contract, and I thought, God is telling me I have to do this. So I wrote this book during COVID about parenting. But in the process, I got asked to write another book that I preferred to write, right? And because I don't think I have a lot to say. And so this book, I just kind of said, maybe someday I'll try to get it published. It's hard to publish parenting books in the States because there's so many coming out. So it's just work. It's just work to get it published. So I just said, I'm not going to worry about it. So I've never done anything with it. It just sits there. But what I did is I'm taking material from that. And the reason I didn't convert it to the outlines is because I thought, there may be something here that you want to keep and interact with other people, and it can function like an article. It can function like, here's an article you could read. So it's not just bullet points. It's not just notes. It's actually got paragraphs in it. So it's going to be, what I'm going to try to do is pick and choose through it. But even for the ladies today, if there are other people in the church who could benefit from it, you can just distribute it if it's helpful to people. And they'll be able to read it without having to hear a teaching. That's the point. So the Bible is a family manual. And I've kind of mixed some chapters together for this. This is a biblical perspective on family. This is not this is from a chapter, so I was selecting how to talk about this, so keep that in mind. The Bible is a family manual. Well, what are some key parenting themes from the Bible? I'm going to give you a summary. We're going to focus on certain texts, but I want to give you a summary of some key, in some bullet points. So what we know from the Scriptures is God chose to populate the earth through a relational economy that includes a father and a mother giving birth to children. In other words, the order for the human family comes from God. This is going to be stuff we've covered in related to marriage, but I'm just going to cover it related to family. The family is the primary context through which God brings his order and purpose for human flourishing. The church has a role too, but the church has been introduced to bring the kingdom. For For humanity, it is the family. There are covenantal promises that God has given to bless families and through them bless the nation. So there is a missional component in God's covenant with the family. There are all kinds of examples of parenting to learn from in the Bible. There's examples of good parenting and bad parenting, examples of wildly inconsistent parenting, of problem kids coming from good homes and heroic kids coming from problem homes. You only have to read the story of David to see the various strengths and weaknesses of his parenting. You can just trace the kings and see, how did this king give birth to this son who is so wicked? Or how did this wicked king give birth to Hezekiah or whoever? So I think you're going to have a wonderful amount of wisdom in the Old Testament, in the stories of parenting, which will help us to see that there's a very fundamental thing, is that good parents don't always turn out good kids. And bad parents don't always turn out bad kids. Among my friends, I've seen people be wonderful parents, but their children have strayed. And I've seen people be neglectful parents and their children are following Christ. So we don't want to have the idea that good parenting equals good children. Or we do want to be concerned about bad parenting, but for different reasons. So we have to be careful not to overanalyze the parenting stories in the Bible, because they're mostly told in view of a larger story the Bible is trying to tell. The story of a generation by generation work of redemption to establish an ultimate family of God. There are whole shelves of books on parenting that go to the Old Testament and use the stories as moral models for parenting. And there's a certain benefit to that, but absent of the redemptive historical narrative of the Bible, it's a misuse of those stories. Because those stories are told by the writers as part of a larger picture of the nation of Israel and its relation to its God. The Old Testament law contains various commands and promises related to parenting that matter to us, but again, we have to be careful not to jerk them out of their biblical context when we apply them to our lives. The Old Testament law can tell us a lot about parenting, but we don't want to go under the law and parent under the law. And because some of that parenting material is superseded ultimately by the gospel. The entire New Testament, there are really only two places that directly address parent-child relationships. Ephesians 6, 1 through 4, and Colossians 3, 20 and 21. And these two passages are really parallel passages saying essentially the same thing. So what we're saying here is that New Testament instruction on parenting is not a big category. Now, that doesn't mean that New Testament doesn't speak to it. But what I'm saying is that you don't sort of start with, what does the New Testament say about parenting? It only says this. We have to address those texts, but we have to go to the greater sweep of what the New Testament is saying in its instruction. We'll talk later today about what Jesus says about children. But again, Jesus is not primarily directing parents and children in what he's saying. He's pointing to kingdom values. So Jesus loved children, but his view of family was countercultural in many ways. He brought a new family into existence. It is a family of eternal significance. No earthly commitment to family should have greater priority than participation in the family of God. That is a radical thing in his time, and in many places it's a radical thing now. And so it's interesting I guess in cultures maybe where, like you're talking about your culture in transition, the place it might hit home is the demands of extended family or parents on you as a believer, and a rejection of your choices to make the church your primary family of faith. That can create challenges. And so I think in certain ways, and certainly in Asian cultures, Chinese cultures, Korean cultures in particular, for children to move outside the family to express their faith in the church, if the family is not involved, is shameful on the family. So in the Western culture, particularly in the progressive Western culture, the issue is more, there's such a center of parenting and valuing and getting my identity from parenting that I don't bring my children into the church. My goal is my children are going to be an extension of me. So they need to be successful so that people know I'm a good person. That's how it's defined in our culture. They need to be happy. So there's great shame if your child doesn't have a good job in our culture. And so therefore people reject the church, even believers reject the church, and instead invest in making sure their children are as best as possible prepared to excel in higher education. So still the same thing applies. Jesus provides a counterculture to that, and that is the family of God. And parenting, like marriage, points to something far more eternally significant than simply raising good or successful kids. So that's an overview of how I would say the Bible speaks to the issue of parenting. What I believe we get from the Bible is a vision for God-centered and therefore God-centered life and therefore God-centered family. The Bible recognizes the value and potential of children, and it recognizes the calling and role of the parent. But it places those two aspects into the greater context of people living under the care and purposes of God. This vision for parenting is not child-centered, and it's not parent-centered. It's not even family-centered. The Bible is not family-centered. There are churches in the United States that advertise themselves, we are a family-centered church. We want to come and we want to make sure that everything we do is in regard to the family. I would say that that's not a clean, clear perspective on the role of the church. The church is not primarily a support institution for the family. It is a representation of the family of God into which you can bring your family and grow together. But a church cannot become a supporter of the family. The family needs to be enveloped in the eternal family of God. Family is a God-centered and God-shaped view. The biblical view is a God-centered and God-shaped view that recognizes that God in Christ is at work in the lives of everyone in the family for His own good purposes. Parenting is not only being part of God's dealing with your child, but allowing your child to be part of God's dealing with you. Some of these things may come out in our conversations today, but if you think as the parent, you are not being sanctified in your life by your children. If you think you're not meant to grow, then you are missing the point of why God puts children in your life. This is not a one-way expression. What should happen in the family is God should work through you for the good of your children, but God will place children into your life with particular strengths and weaknesses because He's trying to get at things in you. If you have a child, for example, that is difficult and doesn't respond well to instruction, that's God's sanctifying work in you. It's not, well, we must have a bad kid, we must be failing. No. God can work in a child's heart, but God is not going to deliver to you easy children, or necessarily healthy children, or necessarily attractive children, or necessarily bright children, or skilled children. He's going to deliver to you sinners in need of grace and call you to walk with them as they grow up. So the biblical view of parenting is not so parent-centered that it treats children simply as the products of my work. And it's not so parenting-centered to treat my identity is to make my children successful. The family is a sanctification environment where everybody needs Jesus. And that's how we have to approach it. So we're talking about a covenantal mission for family. This is actually the covenantal mission of my family, how my wife and I, as we began to have kids, tried to orient ourselves to what was because we had kid 10 years apart, essentially a 30-year investment in child raising and a continual identity as parents of adult children. So we have not stopped being parents. Our role has changed, but our identity, the way we relate in that role has changed. But we were, for 30 years, actively parenting. And it comes from Joshua 24:15, not surprising. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now, Joshua, you're familiar with this. He's an Israelite leader who took over from Moses to get God's people into the promised land. He was young. He had shown remarkable faith as an advanced scout. This faith carried through considerable external battles and clan infighting before Israel's settlement became secure. This declaration I just quoted comes from his final speech as their leader in the midst of a call for God's people to live out the purpose for which they've been set apart. Here's how Joshua's statement has served as my mission statement for our family. And I just break it down. Joshua says, but as for me. The but here is very important because it states a contrast. A contrast between the way things can be, flowing with the world, and the way they need to be in the way I handle my family. But as for me is a declaration. It is a statement that says, I will not go the way of others. I will not do it the way it's being done around me. I will go a different way. We need to start there. If you're going to parent, you need to do exactly what we did earlier today and identify the cultural draw and flow of your world that will tell you how to parent. The first thing you're going to encounter as you begin to parent is the realization that I bring an entire culture and history. I bring an external culture, which we've talked about, but you also bring an internal culture. You bring how you were parented into your parenting. You may not have thought at all about how you were parented for years, but the moment you bring a child home into your home, you are now reacting to how you were parented the whole time. And many people make mistakes in this. Some just parent the way their kids did. They love the way their parents did. Even though their children are different, even though the times are different, even though their circumstances are different, they try to model what their parents did, or they let their parents overly inform the way they parent. Others are so reactive to the way they parent. You mentioned it earlier, that they were parented, that they go the opposite direction, and they don't parent out of a conviction, they parent out of a fear that they're going to repeat the mistakes of their parents. So one of the things we have to do in the early, and it's good to do even if you're not parenting now, is to maybe think, what are the influences that will shape how I will parent? If you don't know the influences, they will shape you and you won't know it. And what you will do if you're not careful is you will take the scriptures and bend them the way you want to fit what you want to do. And so we have to be careful with that. And so that's basically what I want to get across. But there's some key aspects of this. As for me, first, and I'm covering material we've already covered, so I'm going to hit it quickly. A biblical view of the family emphasizes responsibility and accountability. Notice how this ties into what we've talked about yesterday and the day before. Just like a biblical view of marriage emphasizes responsibility and accountability in its roles over authority and power, the same thing applies. True responsibility and accountability before God cannot be given to someone else. So as a father and a mother, we have roles to play, and the father has been given responsibility, which we'll see in just a second why that is. God has established responsibility and accountability and leadership in the family. Leadership is a good thing, so there must be leadership. The idea that my children will just grow up, and though, it was really informative to hear how that's understood here because of a high mortality rate in the past. In our culture, it's because we're psychologized. That people just generally are going to grow up because they have everything in them they need to grow up well. So we need leadership in the home. In the absence of leadership, or if you rebel against leadership, it brings inevitable waywardness, chaos, and downfall in any community. I think if I had Michael here, interacting with him, I think he would probably say one of the biggest concerns he has in the next 5 years for this church, as more and more people become parents, is that fathers wouldn't assume leadership. That they would let the mothers do the leadership. The fathers would, either because of work, or because of the way they were taught, or the way they weren't taught, that men would just generally be passive in their homes. Or only concerned about certain things, how a child is doing in school. Is a child obeying? Is there order in the home? And he would be selective in his leadership. What I think they're going to try to help the church with is we need to be radically different than that. The quality of our church will in many ways, over the course of a generation, be determined by the quality of its fathers, not the quality of its mothers. You can get by in one generation with faithful believers who in themselves follow Christ and live for Jesus. But if they are not doing that in their homes, you will lose the second generation. And children will wander who grew up in the church. And they will pursue something else. So we need fathers in the church to be fathers. And many men, because they were not trained to be fathers, feel they can't do it because they're weak. But as we've seen in the scriptures, we've seen this week, your particular strengths or weaknesses to be a husband are not relevant to your role. Your wife may be very gifted and oriented to this, and you may not be, but that doesn't make her the leader. Same as in the home. A father may feel like, I grew up in a situation, I didn't have a father. How can I father? I didn't have a father. That does not remove the responsibility that's God-given. You can be trained, you can learn. But you must take that role. So some of the questions we have to deal with as pastors is, how do we separate traditional patriarchy from biblical leadership through the father? That's going to be something that you're going to have to wrestle with as you lead this church or as you plant churches. People coming in confused about patriarchy versus biblical fatherhood. What does a healthy expression of this view look like in a different cultural setting? You might be planting in different ways. I know for Brian, you're going to have to go back into a Kenyan culture that's going to be different than this one. And you've been there, but how do we take this now and apply it in that culture when I've been mostly taught in an Ethiopian culture about this? I'm not saying you didn't know before, but that's going to be something you have to do. If you plant with other people besides the people that you've been with. What happens if a father is unmotivated and unable to function in the role of the father as the Bible commands, or is oppressive or abusive in the way he acts? How do we as a church handle that? What do we do about that? What about a situation when there is no father present? Those are real things that you're going to have to wrestle with within this idea that God has established fathers as the head of homes. So as for me, and then he says, and my house. In Joshua's time, the identity of the family was wrapped up in the culture of household. Again, this is very different. This is the reason I wrote this, or reason I emphasize this is because in the States, we don't think of household. We think of nuclear family. The family is only the parents and the children. So if you have elderly parents living with you, they're not part of they're part of the family, but they're not really. In biblical times, there was an understanding of household. So anyone living under the roof, whether they were nuclear family, whether they were extended family, where they were long-term visitors or servants, were part of a household. And that meant that household was the responsibility of the father. What that household stood for, how you were going to live in that household was not simply about the nuclear family, it's about everyone who's living there. It's a really wonderful thing to consider that God might add people into your house. Let's say, for example, you are married and let's say your wife's sister needs to live with you while she's going to school, right? She comes under your household. Now, you're not her father, but within the home, you have a responsibility that the way she lives and treated is consistent with God's view of people under a household under Him. There is an order established by virtue of living under the same roof, is the point. Which means we have to think that way. One of the ways it plays out for us is, let's say you have I'm going to use for our sake, usually 18 years old. 18 years old is legal age in the United States. That's when you have full rights as an adult. And full responsibilities. You can be put in prison as an adult. So you can't drink. It's interesting. You can't drink. That's 21. But everything else you can kind of do. You can be drafted. You can be put into the army. Let's say you have an 18-year-old who is your son. And let's say he is doing drugs. And you are faced with, or let's say he just doesn't want to do anything with life. He just wants to sit in the house and play video games. How long should you have him there? Is there a place where you say, I'm sorry, your values are not consistent with the values of this household? You can either embrace the values of the household, or you must find your own place to start your own household. Very common in my world. Well, what I'm helping parents to do is to say, let's say, sometimes it's somebody who's 25 years old, is an adult male, 25 years old, living in the home, not really working, not really with a plan for life. I'll be talking to the parents about, you know what, it is not right for him to be dependent on you for his life. You may need to, we say, kick him out of the nest. Like if a bird, one of the things a parent bird will do is kick the bird out of the nest so it has to learn how to fly. You may have to do that. That is good for your child. But in the case of a child that is in rebellion, a parent is wrestling with, well, I don't want to reject them, but when they live in our house, they're living clearly outside of the way we feel we're called to live. In our culture, there may be a necessity to remove that child from the home without rejecting him. There's a wisdom difference. I say it like this. With my daughters, my purpose was protective. I want them to be secure. I know the men out there who would want to convince them that they are a good option and they're not a good option. And I want to make sure that they feel my oversight, not my control, but my care and my protection. And so for my son, because I want him in a culture where where men need to be able to stand on their own, I want him to be tested. So with my daughters, my goal was protection and navigating how they did it. With my son, I was trying to get him into controlled experiments where failure was possible, right? I want him to experience failure because he needs courage. He needs the ability to not run away from hard things, because I want him to be a good father one day. And I want him to know how to handle adversity. So yes, there is a difference. I do think there's a case where if like, here's a difficult one in our culture. You have and I've got this happening in our church. A daughter has gone to college, and in college she decided she's no longer a woman, she's a man. And so now she wants to transition into maleness. You guys aren't experiencing this right now, I don't think. You may never. I hope it goes away in our culture before it ever gets anywhere else. But it's everywhere in our culture. And so now she's finished college and she wants to come and live at home. But she wants to be treated like a man, including her male name and her male pronouns. And her parents are saying, we are believers. We don't agree. Right? And so they've had to wrestle with, we don't want her to be on her own. But if she is going to defy our household and demand to be treated in a way that our household cannot do that, we may not be able to let her live here for an extended period of time. It's a very difficult thing. They're wrestling through it right now. And they're balancing care for their daughter, even though she says, I'm a man. All she's living is as a fool, and she's vulnerable but we cannot let you define how you're going to be treated in our home. So it does have real issues. Yeah, well, in our culture, I was blessed to be able to do that with all my daughters. I was able to have them live at home and then send them out. In the United States, though, people are marrying later and later. They're going to school, then maybe grad school. So if a woman is 28 years old, are her parents really still responsible until she gets, in the society, she's a single person. She's not viewed as part of a family. So for us, it is different. For the church, what we're trying to help parents do is not let the culture define your children. So no, you want to be thinking, I'd rather have a father be able to be able to release his daughter into marriage. But in a culture where people are not getting married till they're 32 or 30, women till they're 32 or 33, and they've flown across the country to go to school, and they've set up residence there. It's more a function of a divided. Our society isn't so collected that happens a lot. So it's one of the ways that the church is trying to wrestle with, how do we apply these values in a particular culture now that has moved away from a biblical perspective. So one of the important parts about as for me and my house is the as for me part, which means that I can't have standards for my children that I don't live under myself. I can't say, I'm the father, I have a right to do this. The same standards I call my family to are the standards I need to live under. If I call my family to, for example, to resolve conflict, I can't not resolve conflict. Not only in my home, but everywhere else. I can't live in my home different than I live in the world. I have to live out the values that I'm placing over my household. And so you will see hypocrisy among believers, where a man will either be very active and engaged in ministry in the church, but very disengaged at home. Or he will have integrity in his business, but he won't have integrity in the home. So there is something that Joshua is appealing to, that when we think about the development of our families and our children, they can only benefit from our values to the extent that we live them out. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. This is the heart of our family mission. As a family, we're going to be committed to the thing that Jill and I valued most, the loving lordship of Jesus Christ. I came to love Jesus Christ. Jill came to love Jesus Christ. When we came together, we said the most important thing for us is to love Jesus Christ. When we started having kids, it wasn't, okay, now the most important thing is to raise our children. No, the important thing remains, love the Lord Jesus Christ and bring Him glory. We do not change when situation in life changes. This is not about being a religious family or a church-going family, though that's going to be inevitably a part of it. What I'm really talking about, brothers, is being a needy family. We are a family or a household where our dependence on God's grace marks us and molds us. This is very important. Christian parents understand themselves as weak, not strong. We are, in our flesh, incapable of raising our children in the fear of the Lord. We are not able, in our flesh, to anticipate who our children are becoming and how we're going to best care for them. We are desperately dependent on the grace of God. Parenting is a dependency. It is not a strength. It is not a skill. It is not a temperament. It is not something that some people are good at and others aren't. Anybody who thinks they're good at parenting is self-trusting, and they will find that their parenting self-trust will ultimately give way to significant problems in their parenting. My friend Julie Lowe, who's a counselor at CCEF, I think she has a great view of this idea of a Christ-centered home. A Christ-centered home is not the picture of an idyllic or beautiful family with perfect parents and obedient kids in a happy and tranquil home. Quite the opposite. A Christ-centered home is a home filled with wandering sheep in need of a good shepherd. It is a home full of broken, imperfect people who see their need for help, forgiveness, and grace. Humility and a shared need of a Savior are hallmarks of a Christ-centered home, just like they're the hallmarks of a Christ-centered life. Brothers, if you're parenting, you will experience heartache. You will feel inadequate a good deal of the time. You will live with a sense of impending failure. You will feel that everything I've tried, at some point in your life, in the experience, everything I've tried is not working. That will be inevitable. Things will happen to your children that you can't control that will mark their lives, and you won't be able to keep that from happening. Your children will experience trials that you wish they did not have to experience. And you cannot stop that from happening. You will live with a sense of inadequacy. If you don't feel inadequate, then you don't really understand the task you're taking on, just like a pastor. You are the pastor of your home. Your people, as a pastor, will go through things that you can't prevent. They will make decisions that you can't stop. They will go directions you can't always prevent. They will do foolish things. They will break your heart. They can also wonderfully give you the most glorious experience of human joy possible, but it will be mixed with sadness and tragedy in your homes. When we embrace parenting, we embrace heartache. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand that this is what God wants for us. He wants us to see our need for Him, not just as people, not just in marriage, but in parenting as well. I have an interesting, my experience is that many parents who have a good grasp on personal dependence on God have a very weak grasp on parental dependence on God. And they think they have much more control and power than they really do. And because they do, they are severely disappointed when their resources run out and they haven't learned how to draw on God's resources. So, this mission theme, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, has served us as a family because, number one, it's easy to remember. I can remember in times of desperation, in times where I didn't know what to do, in times where I felt like I was really losing control of the situation. I can remember, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's also been clear enough to build our home on. I can point to that. I could remind my children when they were wayward. I could remind them, no, this is who we are. Choices you make may determine whether we can have you here in doing that, but this is who we are. And it's broad enough to allow us to grow over time. It worked for me when my children were small. It worked for me as they were growing up. It worked for me in the difficult teenage years. It worked for me as I was beginning to help them think through marriage. It was help to release them into the world. It's helpful for me now. This still works for me as my children are establishing households of their own and they come back and are part of my world. The same thing applies. As they bring their children into my world, they know, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So let's do this. Let's talk a bit. Yeah, I think we can do this. We'll take a break. Let's see how time I want to get to this other outline. Okay, no. You can read the parenting example section. We've already kind of covered it anyway. We need to be examples. There's a quote here from Joel Beakey it's really good though. He says, children are not looking for perfect parents. I've just told you the hard part of this. The good part is this. Children are not looking for perfect parents. They are remarkably forgiving. They have an uncanny way of knowing who their parents are and what they stand for. It's hard to keep secrets from anyone when we live under the same roof. Children are always reading the books of our lives. When you have young children, you don't see that. But it's amazing. Let me finish the quote. Besides the Bible, the way we live our faith from the day to day is the most important book our children will ever read. You have children who are 4 years old, and you think they're never going to remember being 4 years old. My children today, who are 36, 34, 32, and 26, can tell you how I handled things by observing when they were 4 years old. They still remember them. They make jokes about them. They abuse me on them. Dad, do you remember this? Dad, do you remember when you did this? Dad, what do you think? What in the world were you thinking when you did this? They remember that, and that marks them because as children, the way child development works is profound things shape children early, and then they live out of those over time. And so because they don't have a lot of data to work with, the most significant things that they experience, which may not be for you. There are things that they remember that I thought were minor that were big to them. Sometimes they're good things. Sometimes they're not good things. Sometimes they're when I was angry and I addressed them in an angry way. Sometimes they're good things when they say, I just remember when the affection you and Mom had for us, for each other in front of us. That marks them. They see far more than we think, even at an early age. And the older they get, the more discerning they are. We are stewards of our homes. That's basically it. Let's go ahead and do this. I don't want to get to this other outline. Let's pause that and go to the next outline. Any questions? We're going to flow. This is going to flow right into the next thing we're talking about. But any more questions before we go there? What's interesting is the men who most often disqualify themselves either through the way they handle their pastorate or through the way they handle their families are the men who had least awareness of their need. It is your neediness that qualifies you because you're dependent on God. Now, the way we practice it, we understand men will have challenges with their kids. We're not looking for how good is he at what he does. We're looking for, is he aware of his need for Christ? And is he going to Jesus Christ? And is he living out of his weakness in a way that is courageous? So he does know how to challenge his child and make decisions. We had a pastor in the church one time, not too long ago, where he had one son whose role in the house was so disruptive. He was a college age that the pastor said, you need to move out. You're welcome here every Sunday for dinner, but we cannot have you in our home because of the volatility of what you bring. And that's been hard for everybody. But the way the man worked through it, first of all, by seeking to both lead his child, his adult, his adolescent child, over time, challenge. He wasn't like, oh, I'm surprised. It wasn't like he wasn't involved. He was very involved. You couldn't critique him for his lack of involvement. It just wasn't bearing the fruit he'd want at that time. He was submissive. He brought that into the eldership. Gentlemen, I need help. He was seeking help, seeking wisdom. He had his son meet with people. He had people involved. He was a needy man, and he made his need known. He adjusted the way he did things. He didn't teach like he was a great parent or that he had great fruit. He taught like he was a man in need. He changed the way. So he asked to change some of the ways he did ministry so that people wouldn't be as affected by the challenges he was going through in his home. So the way he related to other families with teens and how he did that. He sought advice on this choice. There's never a hint of, well, we need to look at your qualifications, right? And his son hasn't rejected the faith. His son just needs to figure out how to live with other people in a productive way, right? So you couldn't even say, well, his sons have rejected the faith. And there's a great debate in ecclesiology over those two texts about a man with his children, because one seems to say the children need to live in a respectful way, and the other seems to say they need to be evidenced as believers. That's a big debate. I can't resolve that here today. That's going to come down. That's a pastoral conversation, an eldership conversation. It'll be how do we understand those texts. But I think where I tend to be is not that they have to be regenerate because we can't make that happen, but that they need to understand the gospel and the call of the gospel on them, and they need to know that as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so you participate in our home as if we as a household are serving the Lord. If you can do that, you stay in our home. If not, we need to consider other options. That's more, I think, what we're getting at. You shouldn't live in fear that that one bad season of a child's behavior is going to cost you your ministry. I beg churches. This was a mistake we made in Sovereign Grace. I've talked about this, of pulling a man's ordination too quickly, asking him to resign because his children were struggling. We made big mistakes there. One of the most significant areas of mistakes we made, and it wasn't just because, did we talk about this? Okay. Yeah, so in early Sovereign Grace, this is probably worth talking about because you guys are in pastoral ministry mode. Early in Sovereign Grace, our family of churches, we were built around certain values in reaction to the culture. They were biblical values, but one of them was two things about pastors that people were living with that we wanted to be different. One was, we want pastors to actually have character. Many people came from churches where either the pastor wasn't a believer or the pastor didn't live a life consistent with the gospel. And so we wanted to be pastors that you could look at our lives and you said, this is an authentic disciple of Jesus Christ, and we're going to live that way before you publicly, right? We're committed to that. The other thing was that we are, if we are not qualifying for ministry, we're going to give up our ministry. We're not going to be that generation of pastors that stays in ministry even if they're not qualified, whether it's parenting, whether it's marriage, because this is my job. You know, I need this job. I have to stay in. Oh, you won't let me stay here? I'll go somewhere else and I'll be a pastor somewhere else. We're not going to be those people. We're going to be men who, when it comes down to it, if I don't fit the qualifications for ministry, I will resign and be a member of my church. In other words, I'm not going to go find another job in another church somewhere. I'm going to live it out here because I'm not just a professional. I am a shepherd of the people. And when I cannot be a shepherd, I'm going to be one of the people. Right? Those are very strong values. They remain very strong values. The problem is we were unwise sometimes in the implications of those values and the applications of those. So and we didn't have a lot of men with teenage kids. So we didn't have a really understanding of what it's like to parent kids. And so the tendency was to say, if your kids are struggling, it's because you're not doing a great job parenting. Nobody I know in Sovereign Grace believes that anymore. There have been plenty of struggling kids in Sovereign Grace with pastors. So we don't think that anymore, but because we were immature, both in terms of, I think, our understanding of ecclesiology and also our understanding of what it means to raise children, we thought good leadership produced good children. So if the children are struggling, it's because there's not good leadership. A man's disqualified. So we would move to disqualifying a man, and that man would cooperate because he held to those values. He said, yeah, I'm not qualified. My children are not following Jesus. I'm not qualified. So many good men either left ministry or were removed from ministry prematurely. We had two founding pastors, Bill Patton and Alan Redrup. They started the church. Within about 5 years, Bill's wife, Sue's wonderful woman, how can I say this carefully? She had physical challenges that revealed that he had not been caring for her well. We made a hasty decision to say, you're not caring for your wife. We're going to remove you from your role as head pastor in the church. He retained a role, and this is all public, so I'm not telling you anything private. He retained a role as administrator, but he was no longer a pastor. Alan Redrup, the other founding pastor, his children came to a place where they really weren't engaging with the Lord. They weren't necessarily rebelling, but there was evidence of that. But it was clear that his children were not responsive to his leadership. He said, I feel like I need to resign. We affirmed that. So our two founding pastors within the first 10 years of the church resigned their eldership out of a sense of disqualification. And we led them through that. Now, we led them through that because we felt like they needed to be out of ministry. What we did not do is we did not care for them in that effectively, and we did not take the posture that I think we would take now as we want to preserve you in ministry if at all possible. The last thing we want to do is have you step out. If at all possible, we can do this. Now, there may be a necessity for you to be removed from ministry, but we don't start there. We tended to start there in early Sovereign Grace. But those men, because they are godly, they stayed in the church. So they remained members of the church throughout. And so for the next 14 years, They just remained members of the church. Until we began to realize we had made the mistake. And so what we as elders did was went back and we saw that in the way their children related as adults and the children's perspective on what happened. So we went back and we interviewed all the family members of each, both the men and their families, and allowed them to critique what we did. And in doing so, we were able to bring some resolution to some things, but we're also able to see how our part affected them. And we came to the conclusion that we had wrongly removed their ordinations. So in 2011, we gathered the whole church together and restored both men into eldership. And so they've been elders ever since on our team. Alan just passed away. We moved him to what we call emeritus status because he had a fatal illness. And so he just passed away last month, so one of our founding pastors. But he will tell you, he would have told you, and he did tell you, and it was in his testimony at his funeral that his greatest joy was serving on this team and being in this church. And his second greatest joy was that though he had lost 14 years, God had restored him into ministry. So what I'm saying is we take those qualifications very seriously, but no man should live under the burden that his job hangs in the balance in them. This is where you have to work as an eldership. You have the benefit of other pastors in Sovereign Grace who've made these mistakes and other churches who are now doing it well. Don't miss the opportunity if you find yourself in a place like that to avail yourself of the wisdom of other people who've gone through it. You should never live with the sense of how I'm parenting right now could affect my ministry. That should never be a concern in a day-to-day life experience. You should recognize what you should feel. I hope you'll feel, and I believe you will with the men that you're serving with. Anybody here, what you should feel is these men will help me in the most difficult times so that my family gets the best care it can and my ministry is preserved in any way possible. That's what you should experience. So any questions about that? I wasn't prepared to share that, but that's an important thing for guys who are in ministry. Those qualifications, they're necessary to get a man into ministry. If he isn't doing that, you shouldn't ordain him. But once he's in, you should not pretend like he's going to be able to keep them all perfectly for the next 30 years of his life. He will struggle at times. I think we don't depend on our experience to counsel people. Brothers, you will never have enough experience to counsel everybody that you'll deal with. I've got to counsel people in their 80s. I'm not 80. I've got to counsel people with cancer. I don't have cancer. Right? You won't have enough life experiences to use your life experiences. And it's dangerous if you think, one of the dangerous things is if you listen to somebody's experience and you compare it with your experience and you think your experience will actually help them. That can be very damaging. Doesn't mean you can't draw on it, but I find most of the best ways to draw on my experience is draw on my failures, not my successes. If I'm counseling somebody, I'm not going to say, if I'm counseling somebody who's dealing with teens, I'm not going to say, well, I did this and this worked for me. I'm going to more likely say, let me tell you how unbelief worked in my heart when I was struggling with my children in this area. Let me share. I want them to identify with the fact that I'm weak. I don't want them to say, oh, he's a strong man, I'll do it like him. In anything, marriage too. Well, look at my marriage, and this is do it like I do. No, I want to be like, well, let me tell you how I fail daily as a husband and how God is working faithfully in my life to work in my heart. You can always minister out of your failures. We should never minister out of our successes. We can't serve anybody with our successes because they're not our successes, are they? They're the grace of God. So today I'll be using illustrations from my family, and you'll see things because the story's resolved a bit over time that, yeah, it worked out for good, but I won't say I did it the right way. I'm just saying sometimes in spite of what I did, God has worked this out for good. But we're totally off the notes here. One of the things I've learned, right now all my children are walking with Jesus, and I have a good relationship with them. There's no guarantee in 10 years that's going to be the case. I could fall away from Jesus in terms of I can make decisions that move me away from Christ. Doesn't mean I could lose my salvation, but I believe I'm saved. I have assurance. But I can rebel, right? Anybody can rebel. I could. They could. My wife could. One of my children might decide that they disagree with where I stand on something, and I could end up with an adult child who doesn't talk to me. Just because it isn't happening now doesn't mean it isn't going to happen in the future. The law of averages says I probably will have one of my children, or certainly with 13 grandchildren, one or more of them really struggle. I can't live as if I've accumulated good works and that will pay off into the future. So that's why we can always minister from weaknesses. We always, that helps us. Because I can't guarantee that even if things have worked to this point, that they'll continue to work that way in the future. I just don't know. So it's a great question, and it's something we have to ponder. So I want to do this. Okay, gosh, we're going to be... let's look at... Here's what I want to do. I want to look at Proverbs 22:6. This is what I call... This is in Wisdom for Parenting. Are you guys familiar with Godzilla? Okay. You probably know the modern Godzilla, right? Like the movies that come out recently? Or do you know the really old Godzilla movies? Like the Japanese ones? Yeah. Right? So I grew up watching the Japanese Godzilla movies. And in the Japanese Godzilla movies, the reason you watch them is because they create these amazing little miniature sets of cities. And then they bring this guy in a suit, and he just trashes it all, right? And it's just fascinating to watch. And then they're all overdubbed, so you get, okay, that doesn't look like what he was really saying. But the thing about Godzilla that was really interesting, and it's in the case even when they do new movies now, is the question, is Godzilla a good guy or a bad guy? Right? In some of the movies, he's a bad guy. But then he starts fighting all these different other beasts protecting the earth. Right? So Godzilla, good guy or bad guy? We don't know. What we do know is that every time he gets involved, destruction. Right? He could be a good guy, but things are getting torn down. That's the way Proverbs 22:6 can be for us. Like Godzilla. I call it the Godzilla of Proverbs. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he's old, he will not depart from it. I've seen this passage be tremendously beneficial for people. I've seen it in the way it's applied, incredibly destructive for people. Not that the passage is, but the way people understand it. There are a couple of ways that this passage gets interpreted. If you read the literature, if you read parenting literature and they use this passage, there are two ways it generally gets interpreted. The most common way among Christians is as if this is law. If you train up a child in the way they should go, in the end they won't depart from it. That's a law. That's a promise, right? And better say, let's say it's a promise. So me as a parent, I've just got to train, because that's going to prove that this child will end up where they should go, whatever that is. There's another school of thought that's similar to what you were describing in terms of kids growing up. Train up a child in the way he should go, and the way he will depart from it. Your child has their own wonderful path. And your job is to educate them and support them and help them find their way so that they feel like they're on the path they want to be on. And that's what we do as parents. So there's one that you would call an authoritarian understanding, a moral development understanding, and one that would call a personal development understanding, where it's about this child growing up into being all they want to be, all they're supposed to be. So those are the two ways it happens. And the problem is, if we just leave it there, it creates problems. For some who think that it's a promise, their experience doesn't always match out. They do the work, they put the work in, and their child doesn't go along the path. And so then the perplexing question for them is, have I failed, or is God's word not true? And so it can be very devastating to them. The verse, when that happens, becomes a final judgment. You have failed in your role, and your children are the consequence, and you can never fix it. The other people who have the development role, the challenge with this is that they watch their children squander the opportunities before them. And they, as much as they want their child to flourish and be good, they don't put effort forth in school, and they don't make good grades, or they get caught up in the wrong crowd, and they seem to waste their time, and they use their gifts and talents in the wrong way, and they end up just being people who just live for themselves and not for anyone else. And that is discouraging. And so this proverb is discouraging for most people. And what I want to do is, in a sense, gospelize it for us so that we can use it with confidence as we parent. So just quickly on what is Proverbs. I'm telling you stuff you guys already know. Proverbs are image-driven truth, not command-driven truth, right? Derek Kidner says, where the bulk of the Old Testament calls us simply to obey and to believe, this part, Proverbs, summons us to think hard as well as humbly, to keep our eyes open, to use our conscience and our common sense, and not to shrink from most disturbing questions. If you are engaging Proverbs right, it's raising questions for you to think about. Proverbs are obviously short and to the point. My Old Testament professor at Westminster said this. He said, Proverbs are the main point of stories. And I like the way he says this. I think if you're going to engage the Proverbs individually, as individual Proverbs, or as certain groups of Proverbs, I think the best way to engage it is to read this proverb, and then say, what is the story behind the proverb that this actually talks about? What could the writer of the proverb be thinking about and observing? Because Proverbs is observational wisdom. It's as the writer observes life, he makes a point. And so a great way to think about it is, okay, I'm reading a proverb, and it seems to speak to me, okay, what is the issue? What is the thing? That's why, you look at, for example, I forget where it is, but you have the two proverbs back to back. Address a fool according to his folly, and then the next one, don't address a fool according to his folly. What's up with that, right? Well, it begs you, the compiler of those proverbs is begging you to ask the question, okay, what circumstances should I address the fool, and what circumstances should not? So I prefer to read Proverbs as if there's a therefore before each proverb. Therefore, this may be true. Therefore, this is something that you need to consider. Therefore, this is likely to happen. So the vast majority of Proverbs, I think, can be best read as if they are the summary statement of an issue that the wise person is considering. And so basically, if you don't know how to do that, if you don't know how to consider issues that the Proverbs are addressing, the way we're supposed to understand Proverbs is, oh, I'm not very wise. Because this is a characteristic of the wise, is to look at the world and then understand how to summarize the implications of what they see. I need wisdom to do that. And I need wisdom, as we know in Proverbs 1, beginning with the fear of the Lord. If I look at life in the fear of the Lord, I can assess a situation. I can look out these windows. I could watch the workers on here for 15 minutes, watch how they work, and then develop a proverb that summarizes what I see and what wisdom I can get from it. You can look at your children and create your own proverb by what you see in children, if you're wise. The difference between wisdom and folly is, am I reading the right situations the right way? And am I understanding the principle I need to take from that that's wise? So that's basically the understanding of Proverbs and how I want to approach this one. Proverbs are incomplete wisdom, though, because they need the gospel. So Proverbs, for example, teach us how to live well in a world ordered by God. So in Proverbs, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We live in the fear of the Lord. The gospel rescues us from a world under the wrath of God. So there is a difference in New Testament perspective. In Proverbs, we live as if God is over everything and we live under that. The gospel rescues us from a world under the wrath of God. In Proverbs, wisdom is a way to live a God-pleasing life. In the gospel, wisdom is God Himself making us pleasing to Him. In Proverbs, wisdom is attained through understanding and application in the fear of the Lord. In the gospel, wisdom comes as a gift to those who are living in loving trust and obedience to Jesus Christ. In Proverbs, wisdom is successful living in the here and now. In the gospel, wisdom is successful living in the already but not yet. In His teaching, Jesus reinterpreted the definition of wisdom and foolishness. So we can only read Proverbs rightly in light of the gospel. The gospel informs how we view life and therefore the wisdom we get from it. The Proverbs continue to remain vital in our pursuit of wisdom, but they cannot be done apart from the gospel. So we always interpret the Proverbs through the gospel. So, in their place in God's larger story of redemption, Proverbs are best understood as instruction pointing to the ultimate fulfillment of wisdom in Jesus Christ. Proverbs are saying, this is a way to live in life, but you need more. There is a wisdom that must come outside of what you can gather in your own strength. Proverbs is wisdom awaiting vindication. On this side of the cross, we have wisdom vindicated in the person and work of Jesus, who is our wisdom. Jesus is our wisdom. Following Jesus is the proverbial wisdom. Living according to His call, His commands, His promises, His grace is wisdom. If we do that, you are a wise man. If you love Jesus, you are fearing the Lord. What Proverbs promotes, the gospel fulfills. Fear of the Lord is believing the gospel. As Graham Goldsworthy says, the fear of the Lord is both the starting point and the goal of wisdom. And in Christian terms, this means living by trust in Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. So with that in mind, I just kind of introduced that because I wanted to show you that you cannot look at Proverbs 22:6 stand alone apart from the gospel. You must read the gospel back into that proverb for it to have benefit for you as a parent. So neither the moral formation, this idea that my job is to raise my kid on the path that they need to go on, and they're going to turn out that way, or child development, I need to help a child flourish in their own path. They don't address the fundamental challenge of growing up human. And that fundamental challenge is we are pervasively foolish in rejecting God because of sin. Because of sin, we know this proverb can't mean that it's the responsibility of parents to create people who trust in Christ throughout their lives. Only God can do that. The gospel helps us recognize that I can't train my child to believe in Jesus and follow Jesus. So the moral interpretation doesn't take us very far. God must intervene into the life of the sinner who is my child. We also know that children have 1,000 ways they will tend to go that don't lead to fulfilling their potential. The corrupting effects of sin on our natural bents will always undermine the idea that a child, if left alone, will flourish. So Proverbs are truth in picture form. And so I want to look at this proverb in its pictures, and I want to give you my story that leads to why I think it works. So train up a child. These are pictures. The concept underlying this word picture isn't really educational or correctional. It's a picture of consecration, dedicating a child towards something. There's also a sense in this term, train, in the Hebrew, that is there's cultivating direction. We have a formal gardens near us where they take plants, and one of the things they have there is what they call bonsai trees. Do you know what bonsai trees are? Okay. So yeah, they're trees. There are some, and what they are is they're little plants that an expert over time cuts and shapes to make it look like a big tree. So they might only stand this tall, but if you look at it, it looks like a tree. There are bonsais in this gardens that are over 120 years old, that have been trained for over 120 years, generation after generation. And in Japan, it's an art form that sometimes those trees are 300 or 400 years old, those bushes. So that's the idea, that there is active cultivation. It's called training. The training in bonsai recognizes that there are both natural properties of the plant and a need for skilled training to produce a distinctive work of art. That's a good picture of what's going on. There are things in our children that are natural bents and skills and values, but there are also things in us that we need to bring to cultivate that. So it's neither just development or leadership. It's how we see what is going, that individual child, and cultivate them and consecrate them towards something they're meant to be. Okay, train up a child in the way he should go. Way is a translation of the prominent word derek in Proverbs. The word derek is an oft-repeated word in Proverbs. When this word is used, it's more than simply a direction. There's a moral quality to it. Often the contrast is between the path, the derek of the wise, and the derek of the fool. But this proverb speaks of something that is uniquely individual to that person, in the way he should go. So who determines the way he should go? As much as we'd like to hope, we as parents don't determine our child's derek. And in the long run, they're going to go where they go regardless of what we want for them. As much as they might wish, our children don't determine their own derek. One of the earliest lessons we learn as people and a lesson we'll continue to learn throughout our lives, is our choices and options are not unlimited. In our culture and in most Disney movies, an underlying premise is all you need to do is dream and believe and anything is possible. It is a rude awakening when you realize that isn't the case. We are confined by time and location and upbringing and physical attributes and situations and cultures. We cannot be anything we want to be. We cannot go anywhere we want to go. We are bound. And it's very difficult for children who've lived with the idea that all you need to do is dream and you can be, to recognize, no, your dream is not really going to happen. They're bounded by things they can't change. What we want to take from this proverb is this. The path that's in play is God's path. Every child God put on this earth because He has a path intended for them. He has a way that He's going to deal with them. He's got a way. He knows their future. He knows their present. He knows where they're going. He has a path. He knows at what point He's going to intervene. He knows even now the very moment in time when He will intervene. When I got saved at 3:45 in the morning on February 2nd, February 10th, 1981, I don't even know the date, but God did. God knew that before the beginning of time. My path in God's mind was already set before. He knew I would meet my wife. He knew. Now, is it fatalistic? Well, God just controls everything? No. We know the Scriptures. You guys have studied this. You know that there is a tension between God's foreordained plans and our responsiveness and what happens in real time in our decision making. God works all those things together for good. But the point is, for your children, your path is, the path you want for them is not the point. The path they want for themselves is not the point. If we're parenting our children, we're asking the question, God, what path do you have for them? How can I cooperate with the path you have for them? And it's not as a group. If you have 3 children, they have 3 different paths. They don't have the same path. One child might be responsive to Jesus and have a meaningful conversion experience when they are 8 years old. Another may not come to Christ until they're 30 years old. That's God's path for each one. We can never say God is not going to intervene. God is always intervening because He is at work. And so we want to train our child in the way he should go. What is God's path? We want to look at each child and say, Lord, help me to know, based on what I understand is going on in this child, who they are, where they fit in my family, what's going on in our lives. One of the things you'll find that happens is as children get older, and let's say, for example, you move. You move out of country or you plant a church. Let's say you plant a church and you have children who are 14, 10, and 6, right, when you move to plant a church. The effect of that plant on that 14-year-old will be dramatically different than the effect of that plant on the 10-year-old. Will be dramatically different, the effect of that plant on the 6-year-old. But each of them, that will weave into their story, into their path. One might say, that's all I know. All I know is that new place. Another might say, I had a great time. I met friends. Another might say, I left all my friends and it was the worst thing that happened to me. Why? Because God has a different path for each of them, and He wants to create redemptive storylines for them, not for you. So we are seeking, Lord, what is the path you have for our child? And He says, when he is old, he will not depart. This is not a promise. This is a common observation. Life isn't random. The longer something stays the way it is, the more likely it's going to stay that way. If you picture a man in the city, and he's building a stone wall, and he's not going to use mortar, he's just going to build the stone wall. When you build that wall, he finishes that wall. A day after that, you could go by that wall and push it over. You wait 2 years. Over time, those stones settle, they'll actually form, and you won't be able to push it over. Why? Because in the end, it stays the way it is. For people, the longer they walk in certain ways, the more likely they'll walk that way. As they encounter new life experiences, how they've handled previous ones will shape the way they are. This is meant to be a good thing, because in Proverbs, it's meant that wisdom piles up. So, as we train, one of the things we have confidence in, as we train children in the Lord, it's not like every day we start afresh. As we bring them into God's church and help them understand the nature of the family of God, that doesn't get lost if they go somewhere else. They may rebel against it, but it will be part of who they are. It will shape the way they see things. Even if they rebel against it, the experience will help them in that to potentially come back to Christ. If they have a bad experience, if you are a hypocrite as a father, that will stay with them, and that will register with them over time, and that will not change. So the point is, the Proverbs kind of bracketed. We train up a child, do your responsibility as a parent, seek to know what God has for your children and cooperate with that, and then trust that the good work you do will have continued effect throughout their lives. So the way I would say the proverb is this. The way I'd say the story is this. God has given parents an unavoidable role in His redemptive plan for the children He has placed in our families. A child's entire experience in our home should be shaped by the consecration of the family to the fear of the Lord, the worship of Jesus. This is just wise. Within that culture of wisdom, each child has a unique path that is set out by God. Their personalities, position in the family, gifts, bents, and life experiences are all of God's sovereign purpose to draw them on this path to ultimately trust in Him. The goal of parenting is to help each child on his or her path reckon with the God who is over all and who is offering Himself for their hope in this life and the next. Parenting oversight, this active oversight, gives way to godly influence as we walk our family path in relationship to the sovereign workings of God in each of our lives. You have a path, your wife has a path, you're walking that, seeking to do that together. Your children are affected by that. You work out of that, both your strengths and weakness, to help them on the path that God has provided for them. In the long run, we may have confidence that God is at work not just in our lives, but in the lives of future generations to bring glory to His name. Therefore, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is a sustainable vision for you as a parent. You can take this verse and pray over it. You can take this verse and repent over it. You can take this verse and read it out to your kids and say, this is how we know, because God put you in our family. We know something of God's plan. We know from God's covenant. We know from 1 Corinthians 7 that He placed you in our family, so you know at the very least that God has wanted you to be introduced to Jesus Christ early in your life. And God has wanted you to be raised by parents who serve the living God. And God has wanted you to live in a household that served the Lord. And God has wanted you to experience the life of His community in the church. And God has wanted you to see the example of godliness. And God has wanted you to hear the gospel day in and day out. We know that's part of your path. We don't know how God is going to particularly draw you into your relationship with Him. That we don't know. That's why we pray this prayer, so that in the end you will not depart.